We are live. Hey, what's up, fam? Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Happy Saturday. Come on in. Come on in the room. Room. Hey. Welcome. welcome. Come on in the room. Come on in the room. Let's have this brief discussion. Hope your Saturday goes well so far. Good morning. Welcome. Come on in. On your way in, make sure you like, subscribe, share this video everywhere. Like, subscribe, and share everywhere. Hope all is well. Come on in. Let's have this brief discussion. Pretty brief. Today we'll talk about the Sacramento Racial Equity Initiative again, but we'll talk about a specific aspect of what does a racial equity agenda actually look like to you. And that's an important question because you're going to be hearing a lot about racial equity and what our city of Sacramento can do to make more racial equity and what it can do to stop making less racial equity, right? So what does a racial equity agenda look like to you is going to be an important question to ask and to answer and to consider over the next several weeks and several months. So come on in the room. Let's have this discussion. Like, share, and subscribe. And let's get some comments also in the chat if you have any ideas about what a racial equity agenda looks like to you. What should be a part of a racial equity agenda? Definitely use the chat. Also use the comments after the video for those of you who are going to watch later. I know a lot of you are going to watch it later. So come on in, make this a discussion. Your ideas are just important as anyone else's, obviously. So come on in. Again, like, share, and subscribe, and also use the comments and be a part of the discussion. By way of introduction, my name is Chris. I'm here in Sacramento. I'm an organizer. I am a community activist. I'm an advocate for reparations nationally and also for equity and the Black agenda here in the city and county of Sacramento and California as a whole too, right? So that's me. Who are you, right? Drop your name in the chat, right? You know, where you're from, but that's me. And again, today we're talking about, and we're going to continue our discussion about the racial equity initiative that our city of Sacramento is making happen. If you're not familiar with the racial equity initiative itself, check out the last video on this channel. Excuse me. Check out the last video on this channel. It is specifically an overview or an explanation and explainer video for what Sacramento's Racial Equity Initiative is all about. So if you're not familiar with Sacramento's Racial Equity Initiative, pause this or make a point to come back to this video and go watch that last video that we did that explained Sacramento's Racial Equity Initiative. It's a pretty short video. I think it's like 20 minutes, 22 minutes, and it gives you all the goodies and all the details about what the initiative is about, how it started, who's involved, what its purpose is, and how you can get involved, right? So that's what you need to do if you are not familiar with Sacramento's Racial Equity Initiative. One of the things that came up actually in that last conversation that we still have to talk about and flesh more out today, even though we're talking about what a racial equity agenda looks like to you, is what do we mean, and we have to go deeper into what do we mean by equity, right? In particular, racial equity, right? Last week we asked the question, we posed the question to you, what does equity mean? And you had a lot of great answers. And we also asked, what does racial equity mean? And you had a lot of great answers. You'll also remember that the city of Sacramento itself had a definition of equity and a definition of racial equity as a part of its racial equity initiative. But we still have to talk more about what equity actually means, because that's going to be very important, right? If this is a racial equity initiative and we're not clear or consistent with what we mean by equity, and that's going to have an effect on what actually happens in the real world, right? So, what does equity mean to you? What does racial equity mean to you? Use the comments, use the chat. What does racial equity mean to you? What does equity mean to you? And there are all kinds of ways to define racial equity and equity. Like I said, Sacramento's initiative has its own definitions. If you took a basic, just Google definition of equity, or yeah, if you took a basic Google definition of equity, you'll get a few different meanings, right? And then you'll also get this question of what is the difference between equity and equality, right? So let me pose the question to you also. What is the difference between equity and equality? So we have three questions so far. What is equity? What is racial equity? And what is the difference between equity and equality? These are going to be very important questions to answer. Sometimes we use the terms equity and equality interchangeably as if they're the same thing, but they're not the same thing, right? If you Google searched what's the difference between equity and equality, you'll get something like equity is typically defined as treating everyone the same and giving everyone access to the same opportunities. And so that's what you get when you Google what is equity versus equality as the definition of equality. Meanwhile, equity refers to proportional representation by race, class, gender, etc., in those same opportunities. So, what is the difference between equity and equality? If you just ask Google, you'll have a few different answers, but generally you'll hear excuse me, or read something like equality is typically defined as treating everyone the same and giving everyone access to the same opportunities. Meanwhile, equity refers to proportional representation by race, class, gender, etc., in those same opportunities. So, right off the bat, if you watched last week's video, you'll notice that there's a difference in how the city of Sacramento is defining equity and just how, let's say, Google is defining equity, right? And that is something that we're going to have to. That's something that we're going to have to keep in mind as we are working through and working on this racial equity initiative here in Sacramento. So again, some important questions to ask at the outset. It's important to understand and have consistent definitions of the core concepts, so that way we're not confused later on, and we also get the kind of outcomes that we want. So that's the questions to ponder and to pose. Like I said, use the chat, use the comments. If you're watching the replay, what is equity? What is racial equity? And what's the difference between equity and equality? All right, let's jump into why we're really here today, which is to talk about what does a racial equity agenda look like to you? That's the core question for today. That's the core thing to think about as we go into the next weeks and months and really start to help the city of Sacramento develop a racial equity initiative. What does a racial equity agenda look like to you? And I have a few ideas about what a local racial equity agenda looks like from the perspective of someone who's a Black U.S. slavery descendant, such as myself here in Northern California. So I'm going to give you a few ideas, three or four, two, three, maybe four ideas about what could be a part of a local racial equity agenda. But I want to hear what you have to think too, because your ideas are important. This is about you ultimately also. So it's important to know what you think and what you want as a part of a racial equity agenda locally, right? So here's the first part or piece of what I think a racial equity agenda should have in it. So the first piece is that the way your city, like Sacramento here, collects data, collects information about who is in its city, particularly the demographic information, the racial information, that data collection, your city should be disaggregating that data by Black ethnicity and or Black lineage. So let me say that again and then let me explain it. Part one, first part of any racial equity agenda could be that a city like Sacramento or like yours disaggregates or separates the data it collects about who's in its city, particularly when it comes to Black folks. It separates that data by Black ethnicity and or Black lineage. What do I mean by Black ethnicity and or Black lineage? So right now we use a very broad, very big definition of Black or African American, right? Black or African American right now, if you ask your friends, ask your family, right? What does it mean to be Black, right? What does it mean to be African American? You'll get a variety of answers, but it'll generally center around someone with melanin, right? Someone who's heavily melanated, and someone who either is either from the continent of Africa or a descendant of someone from the continent of Africa, right? Or somewhere in between, right? So like the Caribbean or Latin America, right? So that's what you'll generally get if you ask, your friends or your family, and even yourselves, what does it mean to be Black or African American? If you ask the U.S. government, though, the legal definition of what it means to be Black or African American is anyone with any ancestry in the Black racial groups of Africa. Okay? So that's a really big definition, right? A really big broad category. What's going on, fam? I see fam in the chat. What's going on? Welcome. That's a really big definition. If you were to break it down in a simpler way, you could say Black or African American means someone who is either African Black, right? So someone from the continent of Africa directly, one of the countries they're in. Caribbean Black, right? Which is someone from one of the countries in the Caribbean. You could say African American, which depending on who you talk to, has a meaning of people who are Black Americans but descendants of slavery in this country. And then you have other categories of Black that sort of catch everyone else, right? So what your city like Sacramento should be doing as a part of, or could be doing as a part of a racial equity agenda, is separating the way it collects data for those different Black ethnicities. So when it collects data, it should have a category for African Black, it should have a category for Caribbean Black, and it should have a category for African Americans or Black folks who are descendants of U.S. slavery. That should be a specific category in and of itself also. So that's the first part of what could be in an equity agenda locally. Why is that important to do? First, because the African American or Black population, as the cliche goes, is not a monolith, right? Excuse me. So there are different experiences, different cultures, different social status for the different types of Black folks. And the only way you'll be able to see that and or then make policy, make changes that recognize that is if you actually collect data in a way that helps you see that. And the way you collect data in a way that helps you see that is by separating or disaggregating data. So that's the first part of a local equity agenda that a city like Sacramento can do, and a city like yours can do. What's next though? The second part of a racial equity agenda locally is that in addition to your city starting to collect data by separating the different Black ethnicities, your city can and should locally also regularly collect data on wealth and wealth inequality. So right now, our cities, and I'm speaking from experience here, so cities in California, from what I understand, but definitely the city of Sacramento, does not necessarily regularly collect data on the wealth position of its citizens. And by wealth, I mean simply a very standard definition of wealth. It is the value of your all your assets minus the value of all your debt. So it's what you own minus what you owe, just expressed as a number, right? As a dollar figure. Right now, the city of Sacramento doesn't collect wealth data on its citizens and on the families here in Sacramento, from what I understand. And the it's probably the same where you are, right? Why is it important to collect data on wealth though? Well, and wealth inequality. Well, wealth and wealth inequality, from what we understand from some of the most smartest people who study this kind of stuff and study racial equity and study equity, etc., is that wealth inequality is two things. It's at least two things. So wealth and wealth inequality is at least two things. One, it's the most best indicator of the effect of the past on the present. And two, it's also the most best indicator of the effect of structural racism or structural inequity over time. So if we want to understand racial equity, racial inequity well, we have to look at what are the indicators of that. And the best indicator that we have right now, according to the people who study this, is wealth and wealth inequality. But we have a problem. Our cities, Sacramento in particular, does not collect data on wealth inequality, right? Doesn't collect data on wealth at all, from what I can tell. So the second part of a racial equity agenda locally can be to require or to mandate that cities like ours here in Sacramento start to collect data on wealth and wealth inequality among its citizens. So we have two parts right now to a racial equity agenda locally. Two very straightforward, I won't say simple, but straightforward recommendations for a city like Sacramento. One, to start to separate or disaggregate the data it collects by Black ethnicity and or black lineage, excuse me, including a category for African Americans or Black folks who descend from U.S. slavery as a specific category within that kind of data collection. Second, to require or mandate a city like Sacramento or like yours to regularly collect data on wealth and wealth inequality. Okay, so those are two very straightforward things that could be on a local equity agenda. You could, in theory, propose those to your city officials. You could organize around these two ideas. You could mobilize around these two ideas. Here's a third component or part of what a racial equity agenda could look like locally in your city or here in Sacramento. And it's related to the second part, actually. So what you and what we rather can do here in Sacramento is analyze and audit any local ordinances or any local laws or any local policies for their impact on racial wealth and racial wealth inequality. before those laws, those policies become real, become legal, become implemented. So a simple way to say that is before any local law or any local policy goes into effect becomes law, our cities, Sacramento in particular, can and probably should examine or analyze what the impact of this local law or policy is going to be on on racial wealth and on wealth inequality in the city. So before we impose a new sales tax, before we require a certain percentage of our general fund money to go to a certain program or priority, before we do this new development deal, right? Before we do this new hiring deal, before whatever we do, we ask ourselves, wait, what is going to be the impact on racial wealth inequality and wealth inequality here in our city before we do it? And this flows pretty naturally from that question. The next question is, okay, if we find out that it's going to have a negative effect, do we do it or do we not do it? Obviously, you don't want to do anything that hurts or that makes racial wealth inequality locally worse. But that's the next question. Do we do anything that has a negative impact on wealth inequality in our city now that we're collecting data on it and now that we're doing an analysis of our policies on it, right? If it has a neutral effect, meaning not a positive, not a negative, but a neutral effect, meaning it leaves the current status in place, do we actually do it? If it has a positive effect, we probably want to do it, right? But these are the questions that come afterwards, and this is the result of having something like this third idea, which is requiring or mandating that our cities do a racial wealth audit or a racial wealth impact analysis on any policy or any ordinance or anything that we do before we do it. And then we look at the potential impact and then make our decision about whether or not we want to go forward based on that potential impact, right? So that's the third part of what could be on your and our local racial equity agenda here in our city of Sacramento or wherever you are. I wanted to keep this pretty short. So the last thing I'll say is there's one more thing that your city can do to support a racial equity initiative, or to support a racial to create a local racial equity agenda in your city, rather. And that is, your city can issue a legislative correspondence or a letter of some kind to the federal government supporting reparations for those of us Black folks who descend from U.S. slavery. So this may seem like something that is sort of different than the other three, right? But our cities regularly are advocating for policy that it thinks is good for itself at the state level and at the federal level. Even though we're a city, I feel like every month at least, definitely every quarter, we'll send a letter to some part of the state or some part of the federal government saying, hey, we, the city of Sacramento, support this statewide policy, or we, the city of Sacramento, support this federal policy. And so one of the things that our cities can do to support a racial equity agenda, one of the things that should be on a racial equity agenda is requiring or mandating or encouraging our cities to send a letter to the federal government supporting reparations for those Black folks who are descendants of U.S. slavery. So that's the four basic pieces of what could be on your local city's racial equity agenda and our city's racial equity agenda here as well. First, mandate or require that our cities disaggregate or separate data it collects by Black ethnicity and by Black lineage, making sure that it includes a category specifically for Black folks who descend from U.S. slavery. Secondly, we can mandate or require or encourage our cities to regularly collect data on wealth and wealth inequality. Third, we can mandate or require our cities to analyze and audit any ordinances or any policy for their impact on racial wealth and racial wealth inequality. And fourth, we can mandate or encourage or require our cities to send a letter to the federal government supporting reparations for Black folks who are descendants of U.S. slavery. On that last point, we'll definitely be talking more about why reparations is necessary to racial equity. I understand I didn't go fully into that part also, but I don't want to take this too much longer. But that is definitely something that we will be talking more about, why reparations is key to any racial equity agenda. That might be the title of the next video, actually. Why is reparations key to any racial equity agenda? So, hope that made sense. Any questions, comments, thoughts, or feedback, please drop them in the comments or the chat. I want to wish you a happy Saturday. I want to wish you a great weekend. I want to wish you a great week coming up. And I will talk to you next week.